Perfect. Donc, avant de commencer, je voulais réitérer le fait que la session est
Before we begin,
bilingue.
I would like
et
to
que vous
remind
pouvez
you
vous
that
exprimer
today's
dans la
session will
langue de
be
votre
held
choix.
in both French and English, and you may express yourself in the language of your choice.
So I am based in Sherbrooke, so the unceded territory of the Abenaki people and the Wabanaki Confederacy. And I welcome you to this second Share and Learn session hosted by ACGC. So briefly, we will go over the agenda together. So first we are welcoming you to this session, and then we will have a brief introduction of Spirit Change and ACGC. And then the main part of the session will be panel discussions of 5 awesome teachers that are here today to talk about literature and how to use literature to engage students beyond borders. And then there will be a Q&A at the end. So please feel free to write in the chat to Thomas directly, or in the chat to everyone your questions as you go along. We will take notes of them, and at the end there will be a Q&A where we will take the time to answer to all or at least most of them, and then we will close and wrap up. So briefly, Spirit Change is a 5-year initiative funded by GAC, Global Affairs Canada, that aims to increase the engagement of Canadian SMOs, so small and medium organizations, in international development, and increase the engagement of Canadians, particularly youth, as global citizens in support of the FIAP and the SDGs. And one of the outcomes of the program is to increase capacity of educators like yourselves to engage youth as effective global citizens and advocates of gender equality and the SDGs that can be reached through educator-focused workshops like this one, conducted to improve teachers' abilities to engage youth as global citizens. Donc, brièvement, la série Partage-Causerie dont fait
The
partie
Share and
cette
Learn
séance.
series that is part of this session.
Donc, c'est que Activer le changement cherche à organiser au moins 3 événements par année.
Spirit Change wants to hold at least 3 events per year.
Pour créer des opportunités d'apprentissage, de
we may
partage
create
et de mise en
opportunities for
réseau pour les
sharing
enseignants et enseignants du
and for
primaire et
networking
du
for
secondaire.
teachers on both secondary and pre-secondary levels.
Donc, l'idée est vraiment de partager des ressources
the idea is
entre
really
pairs
to
et
share
des
resources
experts
between peers and experts
pour engager les jeunes en tant que
so
citoyennes
that
et
we may
citoyens du
mobilize the
monde
youth as global citizens
et pour qu'ils deviennent des défenseurs et défenseuses des
and
ODD.
help them become advocates for the SDGs.
Donc, en bref, cette session-ci, c'est la 2e de la série. In terms of logistics for the session, so as I mentioned, the training session will be recorded. We invite you to please keep your mics off at all times, except if there is a Q&A and you want to unmute yourself to ask your question. At the end, during the Q&A, if you want to raise your hand to indicate that you desire to speak, please feel free to do so. Or otherwise use the chat box to share your questions and comments directly to Thomas or to everyone if it targets everyone. And then today for this awesome session, as I mentioned, we will be having 5 teachers who will be presenting different topics. So we have Bill, Nancy, Matthew, Karen, and Kevin who are here with us today, and who will present tools that they use in their classrooms. So if you have any question, you can contact Thomas or myself during or after the session. Thomas is represents ACGC, and I represent Spirit Change. So on that note, I wish you a really good session, and I hope that you will take information and tools out of it, and that it will be useful and helpful to you. So, Thomas, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words maybe for ACGC.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's good to be with you. My name is Thomas Coldwell. I'm the Global Citizenship Education specialist with ACGC, the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation. And if you haven't heard of ACGC, ACGC works as a coalition organization with about 40 to 45 members, all Alberta-based, working on international development with partners around the world. And ACGC also has a strong emphasis on capacity building and global citizenship education. And so this is right in line with what we typically do and the work that we're very passionate about. So I'm coming to you today from Calgary, my home, where I live and where I work on Treaty 7 territory, and very, very happy to be with you. I would like to briefly introduce Bill Howe. Bill is a colleague of mine. I first met Bill on the board of ACGC a number of years ago, and I've grown to know that Bill is a very passionate man when it comes to two things, really, many things probably, but two things come to mind for me: global citizenship and literature. And so the blending of these two things really makes a lot of sense for Bill and for the folks that he's pulled together on this panel. And thank you, Bill, for your efforts, and thank you to everyone who joined this really esteemed panel of guests. So Bill, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll continue our evening.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm wondering if, Karen, do you want to pull up the PowerPoint? So good afternoon for those of you in Western Canada, and good evening for those of you joining us from Eastern Canada. Yeah, and it's my great pleasure to be joining you tonight. I hope that you all get something out of this. I want to briefly introduce the next, if you can turn the next slide. So the proposed agenda, there is, as was already mentioned, there's 5 of us speaking tonight. And we have myself. I'm going to introduce as briefly as I can, but that's very difficult, at least 3 different frameworks about thinking about this work, and in particular, global citizenship and literature and how those go together. Following myself, we have Nancy Carr from Calgary Catholic School Board, and then Matt Sawyer, also from Calgary Catholic School Board, who's now a diversity consultant. Then we have Kevin McBean, who has kind of been responsible for bringing me into this area this year. And he is our past president of the English Language Arts Council of Alberta, and a very esteemed English teacher in Edmonton Public here in Edmonton. And lastly but not leastly, we have Karen Jacobson, who I have known for many, many years, probably more than she would have wanted. And Karen and I have worked alongside each other. Karen has also been a consultant. She has worked in the university, and she has been a department head for many years as an English person and very passionate about social justice. So I'm going to kick things off here. And for some reason, my timer is not showing. So I'm just going to try and set myself my timer and go as quickly as I can. Now I am reading off of notes. So we do have simultaneous interpreters. So I'll go as slowly as I can, but as quickly as I can, trying to find a balance. So this first slide is just my initial take on how do we think about global citizenship, but also how do we think about education, how do we think about life or life experience in general. And more often than not, we think about the ontological, which is just a fancy word for being, or the work that I've been doing lately, becoming, because we are always in flux, we are always changing. Epistemological, or knowing, is where most of our education takes place. Whether that's good or bad, some people estimate around 80% of all education focuses on the epistemological. And really the reason that I proposed this session is the aesthetic, because that introduces the value of literature. And when I talk about literature, I'm not dismissing the other subject areas, although I do believe that the other subject areas could do well to bring more narrative into their classes. And literature, of course, works on the aesthetic, on the way we feel, on our emotions, and often in our unconscious, in ways that we're not even aware of. So when I think about global citizenship, there's so many different theories out there of global citizenship. I'm just going to be very simple here. Think about three ways that I think about it. Global citizenship for me is about shifting boundaries, moving beyond the boundaries of province or city or country to the world. I think about something Gabor Mate said about the universe, the idea of universe, uni being one, verse as in rotating, that we are all rotating as one. And so really citizenship is about moving our boundaries or our borders of awareness beyond the immediate. It's also about shifting our considerations of who we are, and moving into global citizenship, we are humbled by the recognition of the relationships that we have to the planet, to the life, to the environment, to others around the world, and to our own vulnerability. I think often about our Indigenous peoples and the way they think about relations. The phrase all my relations, which is all inclusive of life forms, Wichitawin, which is a Cree word for living in harmony with others, including environment. And in parts of Africa, Southern Africa, the notion of Ubuntu, which means I suffer if you suffer. And these are all different ways of thinking about global citizenship. And I think about the benefits that are shared as global citizens, that this is all about our collective survival, and that global citizenship opens us up to alternative ways of being, alternative futures. Mark Brocker talks about global citizenship, the origin of the word, cosmopolitanism, citizen of the world. He thinks about shifting it to citizens for the world. And we move from a position of perhaps pitying others to compassion. And I love the way Gabor Mate talks about compassion that includes curiosity and considering possibilities. If we look at literature in this realm, we think about literature as appealing to all of these aspects of our experience. Through literature, we come to know, through literature, we come to sense, and through literature, we shift our being, maybe not immediately, but over the course of time. I would argue in a way that facts and statistics cannot, and therefore can motivate in a way that facts and statistics cannot. My early influences included Martha Nussbaum, who wrote Poetic Justice, and the notion of literature opening us up to the complexities, to the grayness of life. And together with Robert Coles, who talks about the moral imagination, both of them argue that every discipline should be immersed in literature, particularly those that deal with decision-making in life. That rather than seeing people as categories, as cut and dry, they begin to see people in terms of their fuller complexities. Mark Brocker talks about thickening schemas, moving us from the superficial or stereotypical, even fact-based understanding of peoples or of others, to a broader understanding of their motivations, their challenges, the reasons they are who they are. And finally, again, aesthetically, which is arguably the literariness or the art of literature. And for me, the aesthetics gets at forces of the unconscious that ultimately shifts who we are. I've spent a lot of time, as some people know, with Deleuze and Guattari, and thinking about affect in literature and how affect moves us gradually into becoming different. If we move to the next slide, and I realize I'm already way off, I think about different ways that we might imagine literature's impact, or what I often talk to students about in terms of how literature affects us. And I think about the changes of self, the psychological, but also how literature forces us to think about ourselves. I think about how literature shifts our relationships with others, the social or the political. And finally, I think about how literature affects us ethically, how we behave in the world towards others. And of course, it's very, very difficult to think about evidence, but trust me, there is plenty of evidence to show that diverse forms of literature do impact all three areas. One of the references that you will get refers to Grace Lin, who has a TED Talk out there about teaching young elementary classrooms and bringing in Chinese texts that one of them self-authored, that in fact the teacher said changed the way other students behave towards the Chinese immigrant students in the classroom, and how they stopped their bullying and started to see them in a very different light. Again, I think of Susan Chu, who talks about literature shifting us towards a hospitable imagination, a way of warming to others, of breaking down walls of division. And finally, I think about Jennifer Hart Davis and Tracy Smiles, who talk about the importance of not simply looking elsewhere for social justices or social injustices, but it's really important, rather than othering or looking objectively at the horrible things happening, that we first look in our own backyard. And so I think about the global, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that work on all levels for all countries, including our own. And they talk about a science project where students first look at water and how water is used and consumed here in North America before they look at the sub-Saharan. If you go to the next slide, very quickly, I have a slide of Frantz Fanon, who is a significant influence of mine. And he talks about I think about literature as moving us beyond how we typically talk about multiculturalism in North America and the superficial elements, usually superficial, although they don't have to be. Some people talk about the 5 F's. I think about the 7 F's: food, flags, festivals, famous people, folklore, fashion, and fights. But that only focusing on those can actually do more harm than good. So I turn to my third framework. If you can move the slide. And very simply put, many of you have seen this: mirrors. Books become mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And if you look, there's plenty of references to various takes on this, going back to Stiles in 1988 and perhaps further back. But too often, I think that these are looked at in a very simplistic way. So if I go to the next slide, you can see that it gets a little bit more nuanced as we start to look at pictures reflecting a child's reality, or else they may feel left out. That windows start to, the more ignorant people are about each other, the more they mistrust. And so it breaks down that strangeness. It breaks down the otherness. And finally, doors as a way to understand other cultures through immersion. Very briefly, there's a number of comments here. Critical theories put into dialogue with children's literature so that we can more deeply understand the cultural, social, political, and economic context of children's texts and the ways in which these texts shape how children view and interact with the social world. When a window or mirror of a marginalized group is used in instruction or available in the classroom, it is essential that the content counters stereotypes and deficit perspectives. So there are some warnings here. Enriquez talks about if we present students with foggy mirrors, we might also be stereotyping them and their families, so the importance of accuracy. Abozina suggests, similar to Frantz Fanon or Glenn Coulthard in Canada, the way that we see ourselves in the world impacts our performance and whether we think we can be successful, as does the way others see and value us. Sorry. As windows, books can foster curiosity, compassion, critical literacy, and collective action. But if that window is limited in size and scope, how much of a view does it actually provide? And finally, the benefit of the door beyond the windows and mirrors. As Braden and Rodriguez note, it may offer more immersive and therefore more dynamic experiences, allowing us to recognize that cultures are not static and that no ethnic group is monolithic in nature, that cultures are always changing. Move on to the next one, and I realize I have very little time for 15 slides, so I'm just going to wrap this up very quickly. The next slide is really a way of thinking about these. And I think about books when I examine a book, both how that might it benefit and how might it harm the reader. How might it benefit? How might it harm the society in which that reader will live and contribute? And how it might benefit and how it might harm the planet. And all of these are at work. All of these are threats. All of these are risks whenever we look at a book. So we look at books in terms of authenticity, accuracy, the diversity or intersectionality and the representation. We look at books for underrepresentation, misrepresentation, overrepresentation, false representation, and one-sided representation. And so without going into these, I'll quickly close it off with this next slide so you have a context. So I've just thrown out 4 case studies that you might consider. And yes, these are in some ways extreme, but if you think of 4 possible readers in your classroom, or actually 2 possible readers and 2 possible books. So if a white middle-class heterosexual male is reading a book written by and about a white urban middle-class male experience, how might that affect them as a window, a mirror, a door? Or if that same reader reads a book about female or non-binary experience living in rural Somaliland. And then you think of the other students in your class, often minorities, the Somalian female refugee in Canada, reading a book written by and about a white middle-class male experience. And then that same student reading about a female or non-binary experience living in rural Somaliland. And this is still very simplistic because, of course, each of these is much more complex, and that may not be the Somalians' experience. And so it's important that we look otherwise. So I think about books, how books work as mirrors, windows, or doors is dependent on who are the readers, who we are at the moment in time, our recognized and unrecognized pieces of identity. What are our dominant experiences up to that point of reading? How we want to be seen in the world, how we think others see us in the world, the ecology of our surroundings when we encounter a text. Are we in a class where we are a small minority or by ourselves? What is our teacher doing at the time we are reading? I think of the dangers of books, and I think about the discomfort and how we need to engage our students and support them in becoming uncomfortable with books. I think about the dangers of books as reinforcing normativities and reinforcing myths, like what does it mean to be a success in the world, that are fueled by the myths of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. And so I don't share what some of my colleagues have said in previous years, that all reading is good reading, because some reading can be dangerous and some reading can actually do harm. When I think about what that young person, the Somalian student in a class, gets out of a book that is all about whites and doesn't see herself, or even about what the white male student reads when they only get white male, and how it bends how they see themselves. And so these other slides, I'm not going to go through them, obviously. I played with, even though I spent hours on this, I was playing with Marguerite. Many of you know I tend to go overboard on this stuff, and I love the way visuals work. And Renee Magritte has some amazing mirrors, windows, and doors. And I'll be happy to share some of that with you later, but you've got the slides. So if you can skip right down to the very last ones here, and you'll all get a copy of the slide presentation. I think they're fascinating, and I think they all kind of deepen and complexify how we think about what books do as mirrors, windows, and doors. And his last image here of the pipe, this is not a pipe, that all books are merely representations, and as representations, they can never be 100% accurate or authentic. And we need to keep that in mind when we read. I've given you a set of possible selection items here. These are some of the balances. This is not easy work. ELAC Alberta, our English Language Arts Council in Alberta, has started an inclusive reading committee where we're all reading and contributing our thoughts on various books. And eventually that will be open to the public, so stay tuned for it. I was going to talk about the books that I've chosen, what literature, but I'm not going to. Although I do want to say, and this is the next slide there, Karen, that I like to look at multi-leveled, multi-layered presentations. So I've got a play, I've got books. This was me opening up the Middle East and the complexities of Palestine and Israel, and trying to have Israeli authors, Palestinian authors. If you've never seen the movie Capernaum, it's probably the best movie I've seen in 10 years. And then finally, the very last slide is the world of poetry. And I know that Nancy is going to talk all about poetry, but I will say in parting that if you have not ever been introduced to Warsan Shire, I highly recommend her work. And I know Matt has also been back and forth in conversation with her. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our next speaker, Nancy. Thank you. And I apologize for going over.
Hi, everyone. So tonight, all of us are really going to share just a number of projects and just a number of ideas and hopefully kind of stepping off points for you. Great stories to read, great kind of ideas, because when I start, I think I'm going to start with a discussion about some grade 12 literature, but for sure the idea of the assignment you can kind of take and adapt to your own class. So I'm going to talk about nonfiction, short stories, and using kind of the fine arts to kind of connect to some of the sustainable development goals and talking about the global world. So next slide, Karen. So we were asked to introduce ourselves. So I am a high school teacher here in Calgary, and I've taught for about 23, 24 years. And I've always been inspired by travel. whenever I go somewhere, this is a picture on the slide of a New Delhi bookstore. I loved if like you went in with a book you wanted, what the bookstore owner would do. So wherever I travel, I am looking for books to let me know about that place. So I just gave you some ideas. In Australia, reading David Malouf. In Egypt, reading Sadawi. In Vietnam, reading Kim Tui. In India, reading Shantaram and White Tiger, and in Cyprus, reading Bitter Lemons. So next slide. Then definitely my second inspiration is my students. And I wanted to share this quote with you. I'm just gonna,
Yeah, you just click this right here.
right there. Sorry. In this quote, I asked my students what they felt about the text that we were reading in school, or the text that they've read. Perhaps this is a grade 12 student the past 11 years of education. And Michaela was very passionate about just representation and not reading enough books that reflected herself. So her quote was, "Representation always has and always will matter to kids of all ages. Our educators have an enormous amount of control and influence in this area. Yet, time and again, I find that students like me are let down. We are either portrayed as our stereotypes, used as comic relief, or are excluded from classroom discussions altogether. Whether this is through a lack of understanding by the authors we read, representation in the poems we analyze, conversations surrounding our influence on Canadian history, or people who look like us in classrooms, we are extremely misrepresented and underrepresented in school spaces." And I kept this, her last point for a reason. She added, "I don't know if this is exactly what you were looking for, miss. So please let me know if I can fix it up a bit." One, to remind us just how insightful our students are and how they still second guess themselves when I said, "Michaela, this is exactly what I was looking for. And we really want to find opportunities for students to be brave and to speak up." So my third inspiration, next slide. Definitely would be disrupting what has always been done. And I'm going to just leave this slide for you to look at later. A lot of my inspiration comes from Leanne Bettis-Somosake Simpson. Her most recent book and lecture is called A Short History of the Blockade, and I really recommend that for you. And this quote is part of that book, and she talks about how writers cannot be mere storytellers, but we have to be actively involved in shaping its present and future. So in the next three projects that I'm going to kind of go over with you quickly, I'll just kind of talk about how we can get students and students as writers to be actively involved in shaping the future. Next slide. So the first project is nonfiction. So a lot of times we leave nonfiction out. It always seems to kind of be third or fourth on our list after drama, poetry, and novel. Students are really interested in the number of nonfiction kind of texts that are out there, and it really allows them to pick topics that they're passionate about. So in terms of budget wise, you don't have to buy a whole class set. So in our school, we would buy 3 to 4 copies of one title, and then you could have 20 to 30 titles, and I'll share those with you. Students have freedom to select texts of interest. Last year, we chose 15 to 20 options, and I do have another list of more you could add. And what students would do is they would read the nonfiction text, they would share a project proposal via Google Form, they would form a point of inquiry from the nonfiction text. So based on this text that I read, this is something that I would want to look into further. And they would research and summarize their findings and create a podcast or infographic. So if we go to the next page. So some of the texts that we introduced this year, you can see them here. I'll leave them for you, and if you can always email me questions about them. So Braiding Sweetgrass, looking at Indigenous studies. Shout, we're looking at a sexual assault and a firsthand narrative about that. Two Trees Make a Forest, we're looking at Taiwan and parks and conservation. The Beast, we're looking at the migrant train. And The Beast was one I wanted to point out. There was a controversy a couple years ago about that novel American Dirt and the idea that it was written by an American and whether or not she was appropriating that topic. So it's always something to be aware of who is the author and who are they writing about. So when the controversy of that book came out, there was a lot of talk about here are other authors that you should look at. And Oscar Martinez was someone who was a journalist following and living in Mexico and following the migrant situation. So a more authentic text. Okay, so you guys can look at these ones later. Next slide. So here are just two examples, and an infographic is quite challenging to show on a Google slide because of the size, so I can share these with you, and I do have them in a Google site that I shared on the first slide. So the student who read The Beast decided to focus on undocumented migrants and the risks they face, and they were tasked with creating an infographic and combining data and information. And the student who read White Fragility, Sarah L., she decided to focus on how racism impacts the health of Black people. And she works in the health industry. So this was something that was really near and dear to her. Next slide. And then I just left this, I just added this today because this was my wish list of new books. So we have about 20 books right now for students to choose. And if I were to add books, here's a list of nonfiction. I think these would work for grades 10 to 12. And they're adding diverse titles, important global issues. We're talking about disability. We're talking about LGBTQ+, etc. So lots. This one, Reaching Mythmana, I'm going to pronounce that incorrectly, is about the migrant trail in Greece. So that is for you to take away. Next slide. All right, so project 2. So the next thing we wanted to do was to make sure that students, because we know a lot of times in the prescribed curriculum, students are studying Shakespeare and then they're studying modern drama, which for many years has been in our school board, we have kind of white male playwrights, and then novels, etc. And I really wanted to use the short story genre to highlight a number of diverse and authors that students may not have read before. So in this project, they're doing comparative writing and greater discussion connected to sustainable development goals. So I'm just going to show you the 4 short stories, and then more information on these is provided in the Google site. And all of this was inspired. If you haven't read this book yet, I recommend it. Matthew Salesi's. The book is Craft in the Real World, and the synopsis tells you exactly what we want to hear. The traditional writing workshop was established with white male writers in mind, and what we call craft is informed by their cultural values. And it really asks us to question how the Western narrative has really influenced what we read and how we write, and what we expect when we pick up a book. And so the short stories that I've tasked my students to read this year really sort of challenge them in terms of their layout and their style. And we talk about why, and they'll read it first and they'll say, this really confuses me. And we talk about what's confusing them in terms of perhaps a different plot or a different character, and not really just relying on this person versus person typical Western plot. So next slide. So 4 stories I'd like to highlight for you to read later on is The Great Indian Tea and Snakes by Kritika Pandey. She talks about a young female protagonist in India, and this one is connected to how to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And the quote from the opening line is quite telling. The girl in the black bindi knows that she is not supposed to glance at the boy in the white skull cap, but she does. Okay, next slide. Embassy of Cambodia by Zadie Smith, I also highly recommend. I picked this up because it actually starts, the style is quite nice. It starts in the way it's structured is like a badminton match, and it starts with a win-loss ratio of 0-1, 0-2, and the narrative is organized around that win-loss ratio. And it is using that kind of game of badminton to talk about the game of life and who are the winners and the losers. So it connected to the goal of the SDG goal of reduce inequality within and among countries. Next slide. Please pick up this book. I think this book would work from some of the stories from grade 9 all the way up to grade 12. And we read the story Picking Worms. And in this, we talked about Sustainable Development Goal number 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. In it, the protagonist's mother works very hard but loses her job to a younger white male who is speaking better English than her and is denied kind of that access to decent employment. Next slide. Lastly, we study Calvino's Daughters of the Moon. I'd say this is a more mature grade 12 text. And in this one, society decides to throw out the moon because in a world where every object was thrown away at the slightest breakage or aging, the moon is looking old. And in this one, we talk about sustainable consumption. So next slide. So this is just for you to use after we read a set of stories, a set of 4, students choose an element or a theme that they want to compare, and they write their comparative essay. So some might choose erasure, some might choose shame, some might choose trauma, or they might choose a specific element. Next slide. And I'm just going to leave, there's 2 student reflections. We'll just look at this one because for time. And then there's another one that you can have. So you can see how the students are really making those connections and coming up with the greater kind of global perspective we want them to. Through their works, the Embassy of Cambodia and Worms, Zadie Smith and Sue Van Kem Tamavangsa respectively discuss how life often plays out similar to a sports game, with each individual being a player. However, when an individual is disadvantaged due to inherent inequality and prejudiced expectations, they are forced to become the underdogs in their own lives, which often prevents them from succeeding in life or winning in this case. Because individuals in these situations may be unable to escape from them, it results in them never truly being free, something that these authors exemplify in their respective pieces of literature. And I love that the student came to this realization, because I think that idea of like systematic racism and systems that really kind of control people is sometimes challenging to understand. And these 2 stories really kind of helped my student kind of see this in real life. So next slide. And that's just Sam's reflection. I'll leave that for you. Next slide. All right, next project. This one can definitely work, I think, from K to 12. What the students did is we worked with the art teacher and we designed graphic tees for social change. And if you're in a school where you don't have access to a sublimation machine, for graphic tees, stickers work too. Students can design stickers and have them printed, but most students nowadays even know how to create stickers and use them with tape. So this is something that I think anybody could do in any school. And we looked as we chose literature as the pathway to empathy and understanding. And in this case, we looked at The Grizzlies, 2 documentaries, The Motorcycle Diaries. We looked at the film, but also parts of the novel. And the novel by a Filipino author, if you haven't read this is fantastic. We looked at the novel Patron Saints of Nothing. So next slide. So first thing we did, so whenever you're sharing a text with a student, we want to identify as a group, what are the issues? So for a sample for you is in The Grizzlies, we talked about multi-generational trauma. We talked about alcoholism. We talked about unifying purpose through sports, traditional ways of knowing, and the food desert that's in the Arctic. We looked at 13th and identified the issues of slavery and mass incarceration. We looked at Motorcycle Diaries and we talked about Indigenous peoples in South America and the social injustice of persecuted mine workers, usually who are working for a transnational company. And in Patron Saints of Nothing, we looked at corruption, the police state, drug wars, and kind of a dual loyalty to perhaps Canada and the US and to the Philippines for our protagonist. So next slide. So super fun. We asked students what specific action or understanding needs to happen to begin to address these issues. And students then work to put that action on a t-shirt.
Nancy,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that you saw the message in the chat.
I did.
The interpreter. Okay, great. Because
I
I
did.
saw that the interpreter has her raised her hand. Maybe it was just a quick reminder.
I did.
Thank you.
I did. Sorry. So really great project. Students loved it. The idea to create a slogan or a statement that compels students who are seeing this t-shirt to action. And then next slide. And then lastly, I'm just going to leave you this slide to use on your own. It was one of my favorite projects that we've worked on. We looked at students, and you can look at all the videos on YouTube. What we did is we combined spoken word with dance, and we created a show that was all about water awareness. So we worked with the NGO KAWST, K-A-W-S-T, and we looked at how can we write persuasive spoken word poetry that compels students to be aware about water issues, and then definitely how can we encourage people to feel and care, and we know that you can do that definitely through dance and song. So these examples, you'll see just how we incorporated that idea of the theme of water through poetry and dance. And if you could do something like this at your school, it just is really powerful and amazing. So thank you, everyone. Sorry, like Bill, I went over my time.
It was perfect, Nancy. We're not over.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
All right.
Everybody, thank you for this opportunity to meet with some teachers from across our glorious country. My name is Matt Sawyer. I work in Calgary Catholic, and actually Nancy and I worked together. Our friendship blossomed working together at a high school, and been blessed to work alongside her for a number of years, and we're in different roles within our district now, but still very good friends, and still, you know, pick each other's brains as we go through. If you could go to the next slide, please. I'm born and raised in Calgary. My father's German. My last name may suggest that. And my mom is from Trinidad. She was born and raised in Trinidad. My father was actually from Calgary as well as my grandfather from just outside. And so I'm a Trini German, and the only other Trini German I've ever met is my sister. And growing up in Calgary, I always got a question, right, of what's your deal? Like, what are you? People were honestly in that asking why I wasn't white, to be very frank, and what because I would always answer with I'm half German, and that never satisfied the question, and so people wanted to know about this Trini piece. My mother is born and raised in Trinidad, and she my family was brought over as indentured laborers, and eventually moved to. The entire family eventually moved to Calgary. My name is Matthew Tyler John Sawyer, or Sour, and when people see my name and then see me, they're confused oftentimes. Names, I've always felt, are super important and powerful, and they're things that we overlook. We often overlook names, truthfully, within our classrooms. Within our students, we just, you know, a name is merely something to identify a kid by, and for attendance. In my class, I'm very intentional with names. I want kids to understand their name. I want to understand their name. Through their names, I want to know their story. Names are so important for our identity. I start all of my classes the first 2 to 3 days, and I'm a high school English teacher. I spent the first 2 to 3 days of every class trying to get know my students through their names. I'll look at their name and ask and try and guess where they're from, where their family is from. I'll try and draw out their stories. And this simple practice immediately breaks down so many barriers and walls within my classroom, because right from jump, just based off of the attendance sheet, I'm really getting to know who these kids are, and they're getting to know who they are. So many times I'll have a kid say, I don't know, I have no idea. And so they got homework. Go ask your parents. And it's amazing that simple activity, it sounds so simple, brings in the parents into the classroom now. Now the parents are engaged with some dialogue with their kid about already what's happening in class, which doesn't happen often in high school English. I'm very intentional about doing this because if I'm able to do this, the curriculum is so easy for me because we're able to build relationships with our kids, because we know that's what this is all about. If I could go to the next slide, please. I ask my kids, who are you from? Not where are you from, but who are you from? I want to go beyond a place. I want them to look into their family story. I want them to reflect on their identity. I want them to understand their level of sense and their own sense and understanding of self through asking, who are you from? And I got this activity from a magazine that some people may be familiar with. And if not, I encourage you to just Google and check out their website, and they're called Living Hyphen. A Living Hyphen is a magazine published across the country. They have podcasts you can check out, and magazines. The magazines are brilliant, and they're written by Canadians who live within hyphenated spaces. Myself, betwixt and between two worlds. And so many of our kids are caught between two worlds, whether it's racially or based on their sexual identity or based on their religion. They're caught between two worlds. And identifying this betwixt and between, this living hyphen through an activity of who are you from is so empowering, enriching, and really helps with the rest of whatever class is about. If I could go to the next slide, please. My project that I wanted to speak about mostly today is called Voices from the Margins. We really work with marginalization in my grade 10 class. And I truthfully believe you can do this in any grade level. You just got to obviously age appropriate. But talking about marginalized peoples, I have a policy in my class, or I don't know, framework. It says actually on my course outline, #NDWG, no dead white guys. As Nancy had commented on, a lot of the literature we expose, that we read and we teach about are from the perspective of dead white males, and that's nothing against dead white males. I know my students have got a lot of literature and exposure to the writings of dead white males, and so my focus is to give them a diversity of perspectives in my class. And so we focus on, in grade 10, margins. We talk about what it means to be marginalized, and we brainstorm and whatnot. If we could go to the next slide. I frame my class on these marginalized groups. I do that because honestly, I have a library of literature that is written from, or created from, the perspective of these marginalized groups. That is, the authors or the creators or the artists or the poets or the directors are of these communities, because I want to know their story. I have an other category, as you see, as well, because there are other marginalized groups. And we talk about this, and I've included youth as a marginalized group in here because at times youth is marginalized. Their voices are minimized. They're not as important. What they say is not of the same value. And it's so important for me to include youth, because if I include youth, I'm 100% speaking to everybody in my room. My project is now inclusive. Truthfully, everybody can connect on some level of when they've been marginalized or they know somebody who's been marginalized. And so if I can connect with them, well, then the work becomes easier. If I could go to the next slide, please. What I've done is I have a list, and I've shared this will be shared with you after. I have a list from these 6 genres, and I have, for every one of these genres, I have a piece of literature that represents that marginalized group. So I have a fiction piece, a poem, a film, nonfiction, art and visuals, and song from an Indigenous perspective, and so on and so forth for every. And what I ask my kids to do is to build their own syllabus. I've got 6 of these categories, and I've got 8 marginalized groups. I have 48 texts that I give to them. They have to pick just one text from every marginalized group. Therefore, they're looking through the eyes and the lens of a different marginalized group, and they also have to ensure that they select every genre. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to empower those kids, right? To take ownership of the literature that they choose. And in doing that, well, they become more bought in. If we could go to the next slide. My entire grade 10 novel project is a project that is centered on marginalized voices. These are some of the novels that I've chosen. It's an independent novel study. All of these novels, truthfully, sit on my own. I have an issue. I buy a lot of books. I'm an English teacher. I own all of these books. I bring them from my home. I don't care what the school has available. I'm done using that as an excuse, because I used that as an excuse earlier in my career. I bring about 60 novels to the class, and the kids select their novel. Again, it works within the project. So it's the fiction piece of the project, and that's insert the marginalized voice that they pick. If I could go to the next slide, please. What they do with that is I give them a series of questions and things I want them to look for: tone, voice, the very English literary things, but I also want them to compare voices. How does somebody from the LGBTQ community, as manifested in the spoken word poem, how are their struggles similar and different to somebody that's a visible minority, as manifested in this TED Talk? And what are the connections from the homeless community, with the homeless poetry that I provided for them, from poetry written by people from the homeless community? And so we're trying to draw connections through it. If you could go to the next slide. This is what I have them do with it. Because I have 8 texts, I want them to respond in 4 different ways. Staying true to my curriculum and all the things that I have to do there. They respond critically, written. They respond creatively, at least one prose, one poem. They respond visually, whether that's artwork, photography, creating an Instagram account, a Visco account, I don't care. Visuals, let visuals do the talking. And then orally. And again, they create podcasts, MP3s, they make videos. Some of them, this is crazy to me because I did not see this coming. A significant number of the kids interview or are interviewed by their parents. And I paused there because I didn't see that coming. And I cannot tell you how powerful it is for me to see a parent interviewing or being interviewed by their kid about a marginalized voice that neither one of them have any personal or lived experience connection with. Being able to connect with home is important. And this project just does it, because these conversations are not just literature that sit in a classroom. It extends way beyond. I firmly believe you can do this in all grades. It's just a matter of the literature and how you frame it. But if kids at younger ages, if they're taking ownership and selecting the books, they get excited. You should see when the kids come in for that novel, because you only get one day. And they pick that novel and they rock, paper, scissors, and they argue and they fight and they want a book. It's exciting. And when they're building their syllabus, it's pretty cool to watch them, take a look at this TED Talk or this podcast and be like, nah, it's not for me. So while I've asked them to do work on 8, they've actually, honestly, they take a look at 15. I don't know the number, but you get it, more than what's required of them. Being exposed and introduced to more voices. The next slide, please. What I do is I ask all of my students to put this on a website. Now, we're not going to go and look at the websites now, but you will have access. I've gotten permission from these 3 students to share their websites with you. All of their work they put on a website. I think it's an important skill to learn how to create a website. And it's my daughter's in grade 4, and she does it. It looks like a grade 4 kid, but she's playing with it too. Like they know a lot more than we do. So let them do it. They put all of their work on a website. It's beautiful because at the end, all they handed is a URL to me, just a link. I don't have 75 pieces of paper that I'm going to lose or not lose. I don't have the, I handed them all in, but I only have 7 of the response. It's all on this website. And it's a takeaway for the kids. They have this website for the rest of their lives, whether they want it or not, but it's a cool takeaway for them. So, you know, before I do any of my projects, give any of my kids my projects, I do the project myself. I think it's important when we're doing project-based learning to do the projects before your kids. It's not just an idea for me. If I think it's that great of an idea, I want to go through it. And in going through it, I see the pitfalls. I make changes as I go along. I see the roadblocks. I can help answer questions because I had those same questions in doing the project myself. And it's a pretty cool experience for me to have my own website of the text that I've built and going through these with these projects. So at the end here, before I pass it on to Kevin, I've included the project itself, a list of all of the texts that I use, and I would love if anybody was interested to reach out and so we could chat and I could hear some different texts to throw in there. I want to network in community and build a community as much as possible with teachers. So thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us here tonight. And thanks to Bill for putting this together, from our ELAC members and to all the other organizers that have made this happen. I actually told Bill about a month back that I didn't want to be part of this because it's just been year 3 of pandemic teaching that I'm sure many of you can identify with. And he convinced me to stick around, and I'm really glad I did. I've already taken pages of notes, and I had even seen the presentations ahead of time. And I'm still writing things down, and it's just a real privilege to learn from everybody here tonight. So I wanted to talk about sort of the process of maybe looking at one text, and you know, I love the lit circles and the opportunities for student choice. And I also still really think that there's a lot of value in having that one class community read that we look at, whether that's a novel study or a common play. And so often when I talk about this with English teacher friends, you know, we're excited to dig into the novel, and the question's always, okay, what are we going to do with it? You know, because we just kind of want to read it. We want to read it and we want to talk about it, and we want our students to be as excited about it as we are. And hopefully we want them to maybe, you know, open up some new perspectives and to maybe take action in some new ways to change, you know, the way that they're becoming, as Bill was saying. And I was thinking about this a lot this morning, and what my my first piece was. And if you can go to the next slide there, Karen. And this morning we had a presentation from some people who work at our division office who are working on some different diversity initiatives. And one of the speakers talked about the idea that students shouldn't read anything that they read should not make them uncomfortable. If we as teachers are reading it and we're uncomfortable, that's a sign that we shouldn't have that text in our classroom. And I understand where she was coming from. And I also think that she was really mistaken, because as Bill was saying, you know, I mean, I guess it raised for me, actually, I should say first, the question, what does it mean to be comfortable in our classroom? And of course, we want students to feel that sense of belonging and that sense of safety, the ability to make mistakes and to, you know, sometimes mess up, and to feel valued and to feel affirmed. And all of those things I think are important. I don't always think, though, that is equated with being comfortable. When we think about that windows and mirrors metaphor, sometimes looking in the mirror is uncomfortable when we see something reflected back that we have to contend with, that maybe we don't want to contend with. Sometimes when we look through a window and see how people who are different than us have maybe been treated or mistreated, that can be uncomfortable. And so I was really kind of concerned by that statement. And Bill started tonight's session talking about the idea that global citizenship is about shifting boundaries. And for me, shifting boundaries is often and can be uncomfortable work. And so this connects to this notion of a pedagogy of discomfort, which I first encountered around the same time that I met Bill and Karen, which was in a research project. And we had been gathered together as English teachers to talk about teaching post-colonial literature and what teaching that literature might, how it might advance in education for social justice. And I found the idea of a pedagogy of discomfort really interesting in terms of, it comes from Megan Bowler's work and people who have built on her. And as Bill was saying, you know, it really focuses on the role of emotions within learning. So that whole aesthetic encounter with literature. She writes that a teaching practice that can encourage students to move outside their comfort zones and question their cherished beliefs and assumptions is what constitutes a pedagogy of discomfort. Building on her work, Burlak says that if a major purpose of social justice education is to unsettle cherished beliefs about the world, then some discomfort is not only unavoidable, but may also be necessary. We can go to the next slide. Further, Bowler writes that emotions define how and what one chooses to see and conversely not to see. And it's that not seeing what she calls the inscribed habits of inattention, the way that we've all kind of learned not to see certain things because it's more comfortable not to see certain things. And that when we do see those things, she refers to it as a disrupting or even a shattering of their worldview. And she writes that for understandable reasons, students may not welcome the invitation to rethink their worldviews in ways that disrupt and shatter their comfortable status quo. And of course, this raises a lot of ethical questions that I'll hopefully consider briefly at the end. But I think that working from the perspective that sometimes encounters with literature and learning and shifting boundaries is uncomfortable work, for me underscores most decisions that I make in the classroom. Next slide, please. So one of the novels that I've been working with for a number of years now is Purple Hibiscus, which is a Nigerian novel from 2003. It follows a young 15-year-old girl growing up in Nigeria. There's civil conflict in Nigeria, and at home, there's a lot of domestic conflict as well. Her father is a really respected member of the community, but behind closed doors, he is very abusive to his family. He controls them. He causes his wife a miscarriage. He deforms his son's hand. And as a result, his daughter grows up just unable to speak at all, pretty much. And so it deals a lot with, he's very Catholic. It deals a lot with the legacies of colonialism, with religious hypocrisy, with growing up. And I like it because it is such a nice bridge between the YA novels that students have often read in junior high, and it still has that teenage protagonist, but it's definitely adult fiction in the way that it's narrated. Even choosing a novel like this, thinking about that pedagogy of discomfort means that I as teacher have to lean into my own discomfort. I have to pay attention to those inscribed habits of inattention. Why is it that I always just go to these canonical texts? Why have I always just said, okay, I'll teach what's in the book room, like Matt was saying, rather than saying, why don't I just bring in all my books that I own? Why do I not question whether or not the book that I've used as my anti-racist text is actually in fact anti-racist at all, or if it just happens to have been decided at some point that this was, and I haven't really questioned it since then. I also have to move outside that comfort zone of teacher as expert to recognize that if we're going to teach global literature about a place that I have never visited, that I cannot be an expert. I cannot teach my students about Nigeria. And that's not in fact my job, I think, to teach my students about that. Instead, I can, encounter this text with them and we can learn together from that text. And so it's in that way a sense of, I think, more a move from learning about to learning from the text. Next slide, please. So I often frame with my students this novel, and we kind of use this framework through a number of texts that we look at, from this TED Talk by the author of Purple Hibiscus, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I suspect by this point, a lot of people are probably familiar with it. It's pretty ubiquitous, but if you haven't watched it, definitely do. I watch it many times a year and I still just really enjoy it. And essentially she writes about how it is that stereotypes are, as she says, that the problem with stereotypes is that they're not untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so she's interested in the role of literature in doing that, and how what that means is that we learn to not see an entire people. We see only these things like, their poverty, and we come to believe that because they are poor, that they cannot be capable of anything beyond just existing as poor. And I really like that within the talk, she brings in this Igbo concept of nkali, which she roughly translates as to be greater another. And so right away that frames for our students that what we're talking about here is largely dependent on power. When we look at all of these differences that we'll encounter, so often they're mediated by inequities of power. If we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I think it's trying to play. There we go. So working with this pedagogy of discomfort means that we will be unsettling some of our traditional beliefs. We start by unsettling this belief about assumptions that many students have about Africa, and I use that in quotes because, of course, obviously that's a whole continent, and yet so many students who, and I should specify because, of course, we have many students who have come from African countries or whose parents have come, and they have a much more nuanced idea. But for many of our students who haven't, I often ask them just to, in front of them, write down what words come to mind when they think Africa, and I just circulate, and I don't have them share, but inevitably, they kind of are lumped into a few categories of, things like poverty and famine and disease, or safaris, or Egypt. And it's a very limiting view. It's pretty apparent that, we have a single belief. So we have to unsettle that. I use a story called Crocodile Tales about a young British girl who goes to Zimbabwe to teach. And she tells her Zimbabwean friend that I want to be hardened by pain and experience like you. And so the students, these are just some excerpts of little one-pagers that the students did showing their understanding of the story. So one of the first beliefs that we kind of interrogate and unsettle is that idea of white saviorism. There's a great Instagram account there. I've put the link to Barbie Savior. That's what that image is from. And if you've never seen Barbie Savior's Instagram account, you have to check it out. It's essentially Barbie sort of mocking this idea that, she's somehow qualified to go and teach in Africa. She jokes that she has no education, but it doesn't matter because she's white. And so it does a pretty good satirical job. I think probably more accessible satire than maybe Jonathan Swift. And so we look at that. We look at some articles around the idea of voluntourism, around things like WE, which a lot of students, have attended or are attending different WE events, and maybe kind of look at how those events can be a little bit problematic in terms of how they present issues. Next slide. So then I have students typically write their own single story, and this really gives them a way to connect. You can see some quotes here from different students. One writes, "I'm Punjabi, but one single story that has been told about Indians is that we're all the same." Another says, "If I were to add, I am also queer, non-binary, I am female, and all of those have single stories." And another writes, "I try to educate people about my stereotypes so that they don't go ahead and ask somebody else who may not be as willing to teach as me." And there you can tell that those are real because there's even typos from students. If we can go to the next slide. So we often then look at the text through different critical lenses. I look at this from a feminist lens, and there again, we have to lean into that discomfort because students have a lot of preconceptions about or misconceptions about what feminism is. Adichie has another great TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists, which was published as a small book as well. And so students, we watch that, we talk about how she defines feminism. We talk about Beyonce, who actually samples a clip from We Should All Be Feminists in her song Flawless. We talk about Beyonce's brand of feminism. We read this short narrative called The Disobedient Woman, which kind of echoes some of the themes from the novel, but is a true story from Nicaragua. And I'm really impressed just with the level of understanding that students already have. You know, in the last 5 years, like the number of students that are coming to these conversations already with terms like intersectional feminism and understanding that, you know, feminism has often been, you know, to the benefit of white women. I mean, students, I just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago. They were using the white gaze and the male gaze. And it was just like, they're learning a lot of this language on TikTok, and they're coming wanting to discuss it because they have some understandings and they want places to discuss more. So we look at the novel through that perspective as well. Next slide. Oh, it's going to try and play both videos. We look at the novel as well from a post-colonial perspective. So I often will just bring in different quotes, ones like the ones that we have on screen here from Edward Said or Chinua Achebe, who really inspired even the opening of Purple Hibiscus. And we just look for ways, how can we understand how post-colonialism is operating within this novel, how we can use this novel to understand what the legacies of colonialism are. Next slide. Sorry, I'm getting time reminders here. So I typically have a number of essential questions that I frame this through that students will respond to both personally and critically throughout the work that we do in various kinds of forms. So we ask, what are the legacies of colonialism? What events or circumstances help or prevent from finding their voice or being heard? How do people with less power resist oppression from those with more? How is power divided within our society within the novel? And what happens when a system of belief is imposed on a group of people? Next slide, please. A few other considerations. One recently is some controversy around the author Adichie, who some people have accused of making comments which are transphobic. And Adichie published a really interesting response to this, which I have students read, that actually really gets at a lot of this sort of internet culture that wants to, I think, sometimes resist the ambiguity that most issues actually have. And she addresses a little bit the you know, accusations of the comments that she made, but mostly it's about how you know, the internet is sort of giving a place for people to you know, espouse a certain sense of ideological purity and shut down anything that seems to not subscribe exactly to that particular brand of ideology. And you know, I think the students have really enjoyed wrestling with that one because it's so complex. Because on one hand, you know, they really are growing up in a time where they want to and are actively trying to be better people, you know, and they are being anti-racist and they are being anti-phobic and anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic. And I think sometimes working with those messy nuances of those issues is hard. So I think this paper kind of addresses it really well. Other considerations with this novel, there is domestic abuse, there's some treatment of religion, and again, this causes discomfort. So, you know, I recognize that when I bring in a novel like this, you know, we have to make space for how students respond. And last slide, please. And I recognize I'm almost out of time, and I think that's really where these ethical considerations come in. So these I'll leave you just to ponder. How much discomfort is too much to bear when we're asking students to potentially shatter their worldviews? How do complex class compositions change approaches to a pedagogy of discomfort? So obviously, it's one thing if I, as a white teacher, am getting certain students like me to think in certain ways. How do I deal with students who have internalized racism when that's not my own experience? And what does that look like to navigate conversations like that? How do we use this sort of pedagogy productively, but also move beyond discomfort into critical hope so that they actually feel that there's a sense of agency and ability to act. And if we're recognizing that there's problems and injustices with the world, then what is it that we can do about them? So hopefully that gave some critical thought, but I'll pass it over to Karen. And thanks so much, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm lucky because I get to come in as the anchor, and I guess that's supposed to be the person who's the fastest in a relay team, but I'm not going to go too fast for the translators, I hope. There are a lot of slides here that I am going to leave for you to look at more later, I think. But what I want to talk about are how I've worked with a novel as well, called The God of Small Things. And so many of the things that Kevin said are familiar and resonate with me, because I've also really enjoyed teaching purple hibiscus and run into some of the same considerations that he talks about at the end. So I may reference back to that a little bit. But I want to start actually with introducing perhaps to people. I don't usually encounter people that are familiar with this philosophical and psychoanalytical concept of felt sense developed by Eugene Gendlin. But that's also where I start in my class. I really feel that English is the perfect place to foster complex thinking that I feel requires an ability to tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, and also to be able to deal with paradox. Seems to be a quality of mature thinking. And so that's one of the things that we can uniquely do in more so, I think, in English than in other areas, referencing back to what Bill had to say right at the very beginning. But first of all, we as English teachers, I always feel like I'm dealing with a paradox. And particularly by doing a presentation like today, where I'm talking about a specific text and the value of it, I'm faced with this idea of how, on the one hand, English teaching, literature teaching, it's all about the text. And a great text, I feel like I don't even need to do anything. The text itself can change us through our encounter with it. And I don't want, as a teacher, to get in between the student and the text too much. But at the same time, I also can see how it isn't the text itself. The choice of the text doesn't matter. Every teacher has to choose the texts that work, that they can resonate with, and the students need to choose the texts that they can resonate with. It isn't the text itself, one particular one, that matters. It's what we do with it, but really it's the context of the classroom and the students themselves and the experience that they bring. We each bring a particular self to our encounters with each other and in the classroom, and to our encounters with the text. And so this whole idea of self-discovery and being able to go down into one's own inner self and have a direct encounter with that is a really important part of my life and also of my teaching. So just talking about where I come from and a little bit of introduction of myself, the idea of fostering a contemplative pedagogy through mindful awareness is crucially important to me. And that's at the bottom of this slide. There's a link to my master's project, which I did finished in 2016, which I provided the link. It's on the Education Resource Archives, not because of parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is my story, and part 2 is research, which into the effectiveness of mindfulness within education. And there's been so much research since 2016 that I'm sure it's already really out of date. But the third part has all kinds of activities that could be useful for people teaching any grade level. And so that might be of interest to some of you afterwards. Just one of those activities, though, has to do with learning about felt sense. I'm interested in how mindful awareness of felt sense can affect teachers and students' experiences of reading, writing, instruction, and well-being. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, on this slide, for you to check out later, there are several links. One to an organization called focusing.org, where there are more definitions and explanations of this. And it's here defined as a body sense of meaning that encompasses and physically communicates to the individual what they feel and know about a given subject at a given time. It's felt in the body, yet it has meanings. It is body and mind before they are split apart. felt sense refers to a body sense of meaning. It is pre-verbal, however, we can describe, name, or express it through art. And there's an entire, when I was studying art therapy courses, there's an entire field of art therapy called focusing-oriented art therapy. So this can send you in all kinds of different directions if it happens to catch your interest. But for me, I particularly use it in the classroom early on to help with students finding ways into writing that are really authentic and that are drawing from themselves. And so Sandra Pearl at the City University of New York website has composing guidelines, and they're actually in video form, 40-minute, 60-minute videos that you can play in the classroom or that students can follow along themselves. And for some of my students in creative writing class and in English class, this approach has been really transformative for them. And also, I've added a link because I attended the second Felt Sense conference, which was about creativity in New York a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic. And the third one is coming up, and it'll be online, and it happens to be related to what we're talking about here, and it's felt sense and social justice. So if this twigs your interest, I just attached it. I recently participated in a workshop in which Beatrice Blake talked about how she works in El Salvador and has done work combining focusing on felt sense and nonviolent communication. So there are various links there to the kinds of resources that from the nonviolent communication side are used in classrooms. And if you go back to this slide, at the Gendon link, you can go to the Focusing Institute, and there are lots of ideas for ways people have used this with children. So why is this important? Well, I think it's really important for us to really be there completely in the classroom. And if students are going to be attentive to texts, it's valuable to be attentive to what texts do to them. So either now or perhaps later, if you look through the slide presentation, I just encourage you to just try out this kind of close attention to what's happening in your body. And this is really apparent with visual texts. And we teach with a lot of images in the classroom. And this just gives us another way to help students access them. Often an image like this one can create certain kinds of topsy-turvy feelings. We can locate maybe a particular place in the body where a certain texture comes up, discomfort, perhaps with this kind of a spiral shape. But we can do this also with the kinds of images that we often have students respond to in writing. And again, in a recent workshop where these were being worked with through Felt Sense, and different participants were sharing their response to this particular image, it was very interesting to see that while many people had similar kinds of warm feelings in response that they could describe in response to this image, one person talked about how lonely it made him feel, and that there was a sense of anxiety and protectiveness for these two children that came up, the feeling that they are alone in the world. And so what it allows me to bring up is this idea that I'm going to talk about considerations for the novel God of Small Things. Like Purple Hibiscus, there are some problematic issues in it that might make it some students or their parents have the reaction on the right to it. We can have all kinds of different responses, even to seemingly innocuous texts. And so I feel like trigger warnings and so on, I need to give one right at the very beginning of the whole course. the particular novel, God of Small Things, I've taught it in numerous times in an IB class. And so in that class, I'm able to say, we're going to be studying adult literature, post-secondary level literature, and it's going to be dealing with complex themes and complex emotions. And so I want you to sort of be prepared for that. But even in a grade 10 class, I really need to do a lot of groundwork at the very beginning of the course before I ever get to a challenging text like Purple Hibiscus, so that students feel comfortable and able to either move into discomfort because they trust me, or comfortable enough to say to me, as one student did with Purple Hibiscus, I realized I can't read this text. I have a history with an abusive father, and these scenes in this book are too close to home, and they're very, very disturbing. And so we have a lot of students that are coming to the texts with more traumatic backgrounds than ever. I've been teaching for 40 years. Well, I'm just retired, and I'm having to be. I learned that gradually to become more and more cautious about the ways that I approach text, but at the same time, I don't want to leave everything behind and follow the instructions that Kevin was relaying from a consultant from this morning, because this is an example, and I'll be putting up quotes for the few minutes that I'm presenting here and there from God of Small Things. So you get a sense, if you haven't read this novel, of Roy's poetic and quirky way of writing that makes her novel so worth exploring. And the air was full of thoughts and things to say, but at times like these, only the small things are ever said. Big things lurk unsaid inside. And so somehow or other, we need to find ways to contend with that. And I was so glad that Matt talked about the way that he begins his class, talking about names. That's what I'm always exploring at the very beginning of my course as well, through different pieces of literature, like A Father's Letter to His Daughter. It was a great article from a couple of years ago that I've been using, and passages from other places like The House on Mango Street and so on. So
Karen, I hate to interrupt. I hate this part of my job, but if we want to make sure that we have time for Q&A, you have a few minutes left.
You bet. I'm not going to spend much time on the remaining slides.
All right, perfect.
So the key thing is that why this particular novel is that it allows us to contend with all of these things. And it's also really beautifully written. There is a character who experiences abuse, sexual abuse, at one point in the novel, and it's a very disturbing scene for students. And so if they're not prepared, this is his response afterwards, the character. And he then after that is always wary, this idea that it's best to be prepared. And so it's best to be prepared if you decide that you want to work with this novel, that has to be handled very, very sensitively, that particular passage. And there are various reasons that it can be problematic. And so, as I say, building those relationships with the students ahead of time so that they're willing to go with you and trust you. They'll defend you with their parents or with others who might be critical if you have built up enough of a relationship. So I've attached a link to a short video presentation where someone talks about why read this novel. And even if you only watch the first minute and 9 seconds, there might be some spoilers in it, but it gives you a really good sense. If you haven't read this novel, I encourage you to read it yourself, even if you never consider teaching it, especially if you aren't teaching high school. With the ELAC committee that Bill talked about at the beginning, we are creating a database, and it has we create a spreadsheet with different texts, and we let other teachers know what some of the differences are that are addressed by the novel. So you can see that this is another reason that I think it's a really worthwhile novel, because it has aspects that deal with all of these themes and issues. It allows us to look at the experience of people from another country and from the lower caste, and those who are voiceless. You can find all kinds of things online, such as papers about how it is a post-colonial text and the different aspects of it. There's information about it, looking at it as eco-criticism. And so I think it's really, really valuable too, because we're going beyond just social issues and human issues, but the planet. For many, many years, I haven't really done much with a text other than have class discussion. And that allows everyone to get involved. In the handouts, there's a list of questions that I've used for sparking class discussions, Socratic seminars, but also for in IB interactive oral conversations with students, so that they can talk about what their understandings and insights are from the novel. And then I've given an example of an intro from an essay. Students have shown through their writing and through their speaking that they really have gained a great deal from this novel. The exploration of family dynamics is universal. And this quote by one of the mothers, "That's what careless words do, they make people love you a little less." The impact of that on the one, her daughter, is incredibly moving for students. I like to talk about how a text means, and so we look at it through close reading. And so there are also attachments in the, or handouts in the handout folder for those of you that teach at the high school level, how you might work with it, close reading through interactive notes, how they might develop that into analysis of a key passage. One of my students actually last year, 2 years ago, was the first time I'd had a student whose family came from Kerala, where this novel is set. And she was a student really motivated by a passion for social justice. She went further the next year in her extended essay project and did research about the rights and needs of women in India in relation to the stigmatization of menstruation. And so there are ways in which the students take their work further. One of the reasons that I like this novelist is that the novelist herself has taken her work further. For many years, decades after writing this novel, she didn't write any more novels. She only did activist work and activist related writing, nonfiction, and so on. So we can look at her life, and it can be that that opportunity to take a hopeful approach, as was mentioned by a couple of the other earlier speakers. So there's some quotes from Arundhati Roy that tie in with that. And I'll just end with this last quote, because I feel like it's what we do as teachers all the time. And it ties into the title of the novel as well. And I don't do great things like so many of the other teachers that I'm always so impressed with, but I do always try to do small things with great love. And that's where I'll end.
That's a great place to end. Thanks, Karen. Awesome. Well, I'm sure that all of you took great information. I found the presentations were so interesting. A lot of concrete tools to implement. I realize my camera is off, I'm sorry. A lot of concrete tools to implement in your classroom. And it was so interesting to see how you use literature in your classes. So we have a few minutes for you folks, if you have questions to any of the panelists in particular, or in general about how to use literature in your classroom and how to engage students, how to have them linked to SDGs. So if you have any, please feel free to raise your hand. And I don't know, Karen, if you had to share still, otherwise we could stop and then have people see you. Yeah, that's great. I guess people are just taking it in. I'm surprised because it's a room full of teachers and no one wants to talk. That makes no sense.
Marie-Catherine, if the people all have our contacts or can contact us through you.
Yeah.
You know, I apologize and I don't apologize. This is, I mean, any one of these presentations could have been a half a day.
Absolutely.
And, you know, this could have been a week-long conference, but we also know that teachers are busy and we're so happy for the ones that came out tonight. And someone asked me, one of the teachers sent me an email asking if they can get the video after, and I believe that will be available, as will the handouts. And they can either contact me directly. I can put my email in the, you know, in the chat. If you have any questions, please send us your questions or responses or comments. All of the panelists today are also on the English Language Arts Council of Alberta, our inclusive reading committee. And so we would love to hear your responses, and eventually, like I said, where our ideal is to kind of build a list that is helpful for teachers. But yes, there's so much that any one of the speakers could have talked for a long, long time. And we chose to try to make it content emotion filled as much as we could to make sure that teachers go away with something useful. I won't speak for myself, but I was in awe of the other panelists. You know, everything I could have dreamed of for, like Kevin said, I was making notes constantly.
Well, I think you're not speaking only for yourself. I think you're speaking for all of us, because me too. Actually, I wanted to go back to high school. That's what I said to Bill in the chat. Like, I either wanted to go back to high school and be in your classes or go back to teaching, because like you gave me such great ideas to implement. And I'm sure it was the case for everyone in the room. Yes, my contact information are in the chat. You can contact me if you have questions, and I will reach out to the panelists that it concerns with answers. And you will also have access to the recording and all the material that was shared today. So all these tools you can take and implement in your classes and try them out for real in life with your own students.
I believe this goes for all of the panelists. There are materials in the handouts that were not necessarily mentioned. I have provided a list of references, many of which have the URLs, so you can quickly find them. Some people may have come here for ideas on how to select text, ideas for text. You'll find many of those references will lead you to sites. There's actually two. There's a list of references and there's a list of websites that I have found helpful for finding these works. But I think, as you probably understand from the presentations, it's not easy. It's actually not easy. And I mean, if I were to leave anyone with one thought, it would be, there is no perfect text. There are some that come pretty close, but the perfect text is different for every reader. And I would say, for me, it's always been the pleasure of the conversation in the classroom and where that takes you, and that students challenge texts for various reasons. I think that that's also part of the conversation. So, so again, some of those websites will take you to texts. You know, and I know Nancy has provided some. She mentioned Granta. There's just lots.
Exactly. So as Bill mentioned, it's not only what you saw during the presentation, it's extra material that you haven't seen, resources, links that will be shared with you, and that these panelists and great teachers were willing to share, and they tried out and they wanted to share with you. All right. Well, I'm very surprised, I have to say, that there's no questions. As Bill mentioned, it's a lot to take in and it could have been way longer. So we will let you take it in and then reach out to us if you have any questions. Honestly, I want to thank everyone, but really especially Bill, Karen, Matt, Kevin, and Nancy for the great presentation. Thomas and ACGC also for hosting the event. It was great to work with you. And we had interpreters today, Danielle and Fanny. So I hope it was useful for those of you who listened in French. I apologize. I heard that there was problems with the links at the beginning, the Zoom link. So I really hope that everybody who wanted to participate could participate. I sincerely apologize for this. I also put down in the chat the link to the next Share and Learn session that will take place on January 13th. And it's really different from the one we just had. So we will be talking about STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. So it's really the other side of the spectrum, and it's related to empathy and SDGs. So please feel free to register. And as Bill mentioned, I think the idea is really to create a network of teachers that work collaboratively around Canada towards SDGs and gender equality and global citizenship. So I really hope that you enjoyed the session, and thank you again very much to the 5 of you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I do want to thank my colleagues, my panelists, because I know many of them, it was tough. And I'm just amazed at how much work they put into this. And I'm in awe.
Yeah, absolutely. After work, after teaching hours, extra time to share. So it was, it's awesome. Thanks very much. All right. Well, see you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.